Shabbat Shalom again.
Shabbat Shalom.
Little story. Amalia, our now 3.5-year-old, and yes, the half matters, has been waking up early in the morning and dressing herself. She not so quietly opens and slams her dresser drawers, trying on pants and shirts until selecting the perfect outfit. Perfect in that she's comfortable, rather than choosing complementary colors and patterns, or more importantly, selecting clothing that's appropriate for the day's weather. Not surprisingly, Amalia has come home from school a few days last week complaining that her fleece sweatpants and winter sweater has made her sweat on the playground. One day she'll learn, I suppose. Judging from the looks on all of your faces, many of you have likely experienced similar interactions with your own children, and likely elsewhere in life too. Many of us can recall moments at home, at school, or sometime during our careers when others with whom we interact just don't get it. When they complain and complain and complain about a repeating challenge that they cannot seem to overcome, even when redirected or instructed to do otherwise. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Well, something similar happens for Moses and the Israelites during their wandering in the wilderness. We read way back in the book of Exodus, after being freed from bondage in Egypt, that the Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron, their leaders, saying, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread." Our biblical ancestors fetched, nostalgic for Egypt, even if what they were complaining about was imagined. We know they were slaves, and surely they did not have their fill of bread in bondage. Now this week, here in the book of Numbers, the Israelites complain again. "If only we had meat to eat," they say this time. "We remember the fish that we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic." Again, they rebelled against Moses, returning to that stubborn, imagined nostalgia for Egypt. Surely, if the enslaved Israelites did not really have their fill of the basics, like bread, well, they definitely didn't have fresh produce or meat either. What does Moses do? Moses responds not by retaliating against those stubborn people, but he turns to God with a complaint of his own, saying, "Where am I to get meat to give to all of this people? When they whine, 'Give us meat to eat,' I can't carry all this people by myself. It's too much for me. Kill me, I beg you." Quite dramatic, right? Reflecting on Moses' reaction to the people's repeated kvetching in Numbers, one modern Torah scholar argues, this is undeniably strange. Usually, when leaders face repeated challenges, they grow stronger each time. They learn how to respond and how to cope. They develop resilience, a thick skin. They formulate survival strategies. Why then does Moses do the opposite? Not only here, but throughout the book of Numbers. I disagree. To me, Moses' reaction is utterly human. Because every time our Amalia tells us that the winter clothing she's been wearing is making her hot, like Moses, my first reaction is to scream, "I told you so," and to wonder how I can convince her tomorrow to make a different clothing choice. After all, I'm bigger, I'm smarter, and I know more than she does. Of course, when I do that, though, she cries and stomps her feet and screams louder than I can. One day, I'll learn, I suppose. You see, therein lies a wonderful teaching from this week's Torah portion. No matter how adept a leader may be, change must come from each individual rather than trickle down from the top only. In this week's Torah portion, Moses had to get the people to change, to face challenges, to develop courage and stamina, to be able to cope with the privations of the wilderness, to learn to do things for themselves while trusting in God instead of relying on God to do it for them. That kind of adaptive change is difficult for leaders and tough for all those going through it too. They need to take on new roles, new relationships, new values, new behaviors, and new approaches. Consider how challenging it is for organizations, businesses, and even families to move from a system in which the authorities direct change based on current know-how versus change that comes from the people with the problem, which often requires learning new skills and new ways of operating. Luckily, this week, our Torah portion offers us a model of this kind of leadership, not necessarily in Moses' behavior, but in God's. After Moses confronts God asking for help, God instructs Moses to gather in the tent of meeting with his team of 70 elders, the wisest leaders among the people. And God says that God will meet them there. Essentially, God instructs Moses to stop, to breathe, allowing for the situation to cool in the time that it'll take for him to gather his advisors, his team, his partners in this work. Like so many of Moses' problems, and if we're honest, ours too today, he simply cannot resolve this alone. We know that we are better together. Surely such a strategy would allow Moses time to regroup and approach his people with a different posture. God invites Moses to become what the rabbis call a non-anxious presence. In the rabbinate, it is the capacity of members of clergy to contain their own anxiety regarding congregational matters, both those related to them as well as those they become the identified focus. And that, arguably, is our most significant capability in our leadership toolbox. Just as a non-anxious presence modifies anxieties throughout the synagogue organization, so too can a similar presence modify anxieties in our home, places of business, and elsewhere. Such a stance provides space and opportunity for learning and for growth. It's a strategy that works for Moses. The people will go on to the promised land, and I'll tell you a secret. It worked for me too. After a week or so of wearing fleece-lined pants and long sleeves, Amalia chose to wear a t-shirt and lightweight pants to school today. I guess her mother and my patience was worth it. Following this important teaching from Parashat Behalotecha, may we each continue to cultivate patience for each other, offering the space for each of us to continue learning and growing. Shabbat Shalom.